Combine a highly ambitious person with no motivation and constant procrastination, and you've created a perfect storm for a lifetime of disappointment. Most of us think that this is just the way we were born. This is what I was told when I was diagnosed with ADD, but the truth is we've done this to ourselves. Let me know if this sounds like you. You set yourself this huge, grand, ambitious target, a great goal, and for the first few days, maybe the first week or two, you're really excited, you're really motivated, you get a bunch of work done, but something gets kind of difficult. Something gets overwhelming, a little bit challenging, and you shy away from it. You hide, and then you procrastinate a little bit, and you say, okay, I'll do it tomorrow. And then tomorrow rolls around and you go, I'll do it the next day. Then the next day rolls around and you go, I'll do it next week. I'll wait till next week. And then next week comes and it's the week after. And then it's the month after. We probably go through this cycle, 4 times a year. And at the start of the year, you have grand goals, you follow this cycle, the end of the year comes around and you're the exact same person. Year 2, the exact same thing happens. Year 3, you're the exact same person, except you're 3 years older. Now, this isn't because you're a lazy person. There's not something fundamentally wrong with you. The problem is that you're addicted to highly processed, cheap, easy dopamine. And because we're addicted to this easy, cheap, processed dopamine, what happens is we have no drive. We have no ability to stay consistent and do the effort required to achieve these ambitious goals that we set for ourselves. And this isn't something wrong with you. This actually goes all the way back to our evolution. See, when we think about dopamine throughout our history, what we'll notice is that our dopamine closely followed this effort to reward continuum. If you think about the amount of dopamine you received, it was closely correlated to the amount of effort that you put into a task. If you did something really easy, right? If you were sitting around the campfire telling jokes, doing easy tasks, it's not going to produce a whole lot of dopamine. It might feel okay, but it's not going to feel amazing. But if you pursued a really difficult, high effort task, right? Something like hunting an animal and feeding your family, extremely difficult task, but as a result, it's going to produce a lot of dopamine. And most of our activities throughout our evolution have gone across this continuum. The more effort you put in, the more dopamine you received. However, the issue is, right now, we have activities that exist up here. This is extremely foreign to us, and this is where you essentially put in no effort whatsoever, but you receive a huge amount of dopamine. Now, what's the problem with that? The big problem is that our brain is constantly scanning, it's constantly comparing and analyzing what's on offer, what do I have available to me? And right now, if what is available to you is something that is extremely easy, but feels really good, right? Something like scrolling, something like binge watching TV shows or playing video games, if your brain is comparing that cheap, easy dopamine to something challenging, something like working on your business, something like working out, growing yourself as a person. If your brain is comparing these two tasks, what it's going to notice is building a business or working out, extremely difficult task, high effort, but also not huge amount of dopamine. It's then going to compare that to scrolling or gaming or binge watching, and it's going to go, well, not only does that produce more dopamine, but it actually requires significantly less effort. And what happens by having this really easy, cheap dopamine available in our environment is our brain on default is gonna wanna make this choice. It's gonna wanna make the easy choice that feels really good because it just makes sense. Our brain will always choose the thing that produces the most dopamine for the least amount of work. This is why when we were hunter-gatherers, we would choose the difficult, challenging things like hunting animals, because we knew that if we wanted to produce as much dopamine as possible, we had to take on the hard, challenging activities. But now we have the option to feel like we've done hard, challenging activities without having to do anything whatsoever. And having this comparison is very, very tough for our brain to ever want to make good decisions. Now you might be thinking, well, why are you talking about hunter-gatherers? Why are you talking about cave people? We're nothing like them now. Well, think about this. 150 years ago, the light bulb was invented. That means all of our evolution before that, we weren't even exposed to artificial light. We weren't exposed to artificial light, let alone TikTok or Instagram or video games or Netflix. Now bear with me for a second here. Australia was colonized by English people with extremely white skin. Now if you know any Australians who are 5th, 6th generation Australian from colonizers, what you'll notice is that they still have pale white skin. Now how is that physically possible? Shouldn't we have adapted darker skin for this climate? Well, the reality is it takes a very, very long time for us to adapt to our new environments. So to think that we've adapted even to artificial light, let alone to TikTok, to Netflix, to scrolling, very, very unlikely. You see, this cheap dopamine, these easy things that feel really good, we have not evolved for these things. We have not adapted for these things, and our brain does not know how to handle them. And as a result, our brain, our attention span, our focus, our motivation is getting crushed. And this is making it twice as hard for us to do the work required to get to our goals. See, right now we think that our problem is that for us to do the work, we just need the energy required to do a task. But that's not quite true. Because for you to do the work, if you live in an environment with cheap dopamine, not only is there the energy required for you to do the work, but there's also the energy required for you to avoid the cheap dopamine. And oftentimes this is even more energy than what is required to do the work in the first place. You're doubling the amount of energy required for you to do anything. And this is doubling the difficulty of achieving any goal, making it way, way harder for you to accomplish anything. This is often why we can't stick with goals, because it's twice as hard. It requires twice the effort, twice the motivation. So eventually we just go, this is simply too hard for me. I cannot stick with this. But this isn't even the entire picture. It actually gets worse than this. See, we have a dopamine baseline. This is the amount of dopamine we hover around over the course of a day. This dopamine baseline is determined a lot by how much dopamine you receive. So here's what happens. If you are a historical, primal, evolutionary human, then you don't produce a lot of dopamine. There's not a lot of dopamine circulating in your environment. You're not scrolling your phone all the time. You don't have Netflix available, right? You can't receive a huge amount of dopamine because when you do receive dopamine, it comes at the other end of work, of effort, which means it's not instant. You can't get dopamine all the time, so you don't receive a lot of dopamine on your day-to-day basis. As a result, our brain has to regulate our dopamine levels. So we know that our dopamine baseline is going to be pretty high. To make sure we're around normal, if we're not receiving dopamine all the time, then we're going to have quite a high dopamine baseline. However, for most of us right now, we're down here. We're down the bottom. Because we're receiving a huge amount of cheap, easy dopamine. There is so much dopamine coming from our environment. And as a consequence, we have a really low dopamine baseline because our brain realizes you're producing way too much dopamine. I have to regulate this. So I'm going to drop your dopamine baseline. So what does this all mean for us? Well, there was a study done where they severed the neural connections in the brains of rats so they could not produce dopamine. These rats would sit on one side of the cage and the scientists would place food on the other side of the cage. The rats with no dopamine would not cross the cage to eat food. They would not move whatsoever. However, if the scientists placed food in the rat's mouth, the rat would eat it. The rat would eat the food and the rat would enjoy the food. However, the rat was incapable of crossing the cage to eat the food itself. This is essentially what it's like to have no dopamine and to have no motivation. And this probably resonates with a lot of us right now. We don't have that drive to do anything whatsoever. And this is why I said that our situation is worse than we originally thought. Because not only do we require energy to do the work, to move towards our goals, and we require energy to avoid the cheap dopamine activities, but also it's a lot harder for us to do the work. There is a lot more energy required for us to do the work simply because we have so little energy. We have so little drive and motivation to do the work because our dopamine levels are so low. So what we originally thought was, okay, I just need a bit of energy to do the work. It turns out we actually need a lot of energy, not only to do the work, but also to avoid the cheap dopamine behaviors. And this is why there is such a big gap between you and doing the work. There is so much energy required, so much effort required for you to do the work that's moving you towards your goals. This is why they seem so challenging. They seem so hard and you can't stick to them. You may last a few days when your energy is really high. You have a lot of motivation, a lot of willpower, a lot of drive. There's a lot of novel stimulus and you're like, okay, we're gonna do this. But when that novelty wears off, when the motivation and the willpower wears off and you're just left with yourself, with your own systems, your own work ethic, you're gonna realize this gap is too large. And if you can't bridge this gap, you will not do the work. And if you don't do the work, you will not achieve your goals and you'll get stuck in this perpetual cycle over and over and over again. But let me ask you a question. What would happen if your brain no longer compared cheap, easy dopamine to the work you have to do? What if there was no longer energy required to avoid doing the cheap, easy dopamine? What if the energy required for you to do the work was significantly less because you had more energy. Well, that's where we end up in this original situation that we think we're in right now, where all that's required for us to do the work is a little bit of energy. It's not a huge, massive gap, it's a little bit of energy. Well, what's probably gonna happen is you're gonna realize this is a lot easier. This is a lot easier to do because there's significantly less energy requirement for me to do the work that's gonna get me to my goals. This is the competitive advantage. This is what will set you apart from your opponents, because not only is it not that challenging for you to do the work, but also your opponents have a huge gap to bridge. They have a huge amount of work required for them to get to the work itself. This is a huge competitive advantage right here, and in the long term, this is where you're probably gonna see the gap widening and widening and widening. We often hear people talk about brain food, food that's fantastic for your brain. Well, I want you to think about your dopamine as brain food. On one end of the spectrum, you have the ultra-processed, high-calorie, seed oil-filled microplastics garbage food. This is your cheap dopamine. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the organic, grass-fed, grass-finished, incredible brain food, which is the dopamine that you receive for pursuing and achieving your goals. If you want to supercharge your brain, if you want a brain that's operating on a completely different wavelength to most people, then you have to cut out the ultra-processed food. And you have to only go for the grass-fed, grass-finished, organic brain food. They might be thinking, well, that's great, but it's pretty hard to cut out the ultra-processed food. It is hard, but it's only hard if you rely on motivation and willpower. And why are you here in the first place? You're probably here in the first place because you've relied on motivation and willpower, and you continue to go through these cycles of having motivation, making progress, and then falling back to the start because it's not consistent and it's not reliable. Now, if you, instead of going through willpower and motivation to get to this outcome, you went through systems. You created systems that you set up that were able to operate despite motivation and willpower, then you're probably far more likely to stick to this. And in fact, you can probably stick with this forever. And if you can stick with this forever and have a competitive advantage like this forever, then you are going to make progress faster than everyone. Now, a lot of you might hear forever and think, that's physically impossible. You can't do it forever. But I'll tell you right now, it is very much possible. At the end of 2024, I said goodbye to online entertainment by myself forever. I literally have not touched online entertainment by myself since that date. And this means that the gap between me and the work I need to do is so incredibly small that I can get so much done and do it so consistently. At the start, I just used this to build my business, but after a while, I realized I could use this in all areas of my life. I took on running for the first time, and I've now run 8 marathons in 8 months. I also use this for language learning. I spent 4 hours a day learning Spanish for 7 months to become conversationally fluent. I use this in a lot of areas of my life because I realize the energy now required for me to do the work required to achieve my goal is so small. I can get so much more done and I can do it so damn consistently. If you want to stop dopamine from destroying your brain, from making everything in life so damn challenging, then you have to stop picking from the ultra-processed garbage junk dopamine and you have to go to the grass-fed, grass-finished, amazing stuff. This is how you're going to be able to supercharge your brain, get so much done, and have a huge competitive advantage in the modern world. Now, if you want to go deep into building systems for consistent execution, you can check out the Modern Monk community. I'll leave a link in the description below for that. If you want to learn how short form scrolling in particular is destroying your brain, then I'll leave a video for that right here for you to check out. So I will see you either in that video or in the Modern Monk community.